Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorian. Now, just to mention, if you can hear background noise swooshing, there's a massive storm going on outside. Nothing like you would get in America or anything like that, but we've had some branches come down and stuff. Had a tree come down last week. But, to the topic of this video, so I'm in the process of taking photographs for my kind of day job, although YouTubing is now also my day job, but my other day job, which is running Eastern Antique Arms, link below obviously. And I'm processing some stock. I've taken basically about a month off pretty much after Christmas because, as you know, I've got a 3-month-old baby at the moment, so we've been a bit hectic and I haven't had enough time to process stock, but I've got tons of stock here, and I'm in the process of gradually filtering it through to the website, again link below. But there was one thing I came across. So very often when I'm handling antique swords, sometimes they might appear relatively bog standard, or typical sort of examples of British military patterns. This is an 1897 pattern officer's sword. This is still the current pattern, incidentally, for infantry officers in the British Army. Not that our officers go charging into battle in Afghanistan or wherever with a sword in hand, although I suspect some of them might quite like that, knowing a few of them. But it is still nevertheless used for parade purposes. Now, unfortunately, there are no companies, in my opinion, making swords for modern British Army officers which are what I would describe as combat trustable or suitable. Not that they need them, of course, but there are companies which sell essentially parade swords. Now, on paper, yes, they might be carbon steel, yes, they might be heat treated, and some of those companies do claim that they're made to the original specifications and tested in the original ways. In my opinion, they are not. They're not good enough or reliable enough heat treatment quality. They're just not good enough build quality. I would never trust my life to one of the swords that are made by one of the modern manufacturers, unless it was made to my personal specifications by a manufacturer, to my special order to by a manufacturer I trusted, and then I would have it physically tested as well. But the antiques, of course, were still made to be used, and so this is an Edward VII example. Edward VII was Queen Victoria's son, and when Queen Victoria died in 1901, Edward VII became king. He'd been Prince of Wales for many, many years, and actually, I guess probably not that many people know this, but Edward VII actually had a personal interest in swordsmanship and swords as well. The design of swords, he took a great interest in the design of swords. He had a very large collection of ethnographic weapons, a collection of tulwars and stuff like this. And he was a fencer himself, and in fact he was trained in fencing by various different people, but one of the people he was trained by was Sergeant Tohey, who was the guy who invented the British Army regulation sword instruction manual that came in the 1870s, if I remember correctly. I've written an article about it. It's on Eastern Antique Arms website. And he also devised the cutlass exercise in the 1850s as well. So this guy knew what he was talking about. And I think it's interesting that Edward VII, or well, what we know as Queen Victoria's sons, it's described as, we assume Edward VII being one of those, was trained by Sergeant Tohey. Anyway, I digress. So Edward VII had a personal interest in swords and swordsmanship. This sword dates to Edward VII's reign, so it's most of these 1897 pattern swords that you find, so it's the thrusting type blade. It is really a dedicated thrusting blade. Yes, you can cut with it. Masiello's manual that was accompanied this sword's introduction, the 1895 infantry sword exercise, does have cuts in it, but it's very much prioritised the thrust, which is fine. It is what it is. It's a decision. So it's primarily a thrusting sword that has a secondary ability to cut to some degree. Not very well, but it can cut somewhat. And it's interesting because, of course, when they introduced this sword in the 1890s, the sword was still considered very much a weapon. It was still the primary weapon of British Army officers. Definitely for the cavalry, but even for the infantry. And despite the fact that they had handguns, revolvers for the most part, although some officers even had things like broom-handled Mausers, Winston Churchill famously did. So magazine pistols were coming in, but revolvers were trusted more in the British military because they could, for the large part, carry larger loads, more powerful calibers, and they were seen as more reliable. In fact, I think there's a similar reason why old school cops in America still trusted revolvers in the kind of middle of the 20th century was because revolvers were seen as somehow more reliable and trustworthy than magazine semi-automatic pistols. But despite the fact that those pistols were available, for all of the reasons I've spoken about in many previous videos, so the fact that once your gun runs out of ammunition, if you're in close combat, you can't necessarily reload very easily, the fact that guns weren't trusted for their stopping power, the fact that you can't parry with a gun, you can only attack, you can only shoot someone, and they still might, if they're charging at you with a bayonet or a sword, they still might run you through or cut you down, as happened many times in India and Afghanistan and Sudan. So for many reasons, British officers still had swords. They weren't always very well trained with them. In fact, it was famously the case that many British officers didn't really know how to use their swords, but nevertheless, at least if you've got a sword-on campaign, you've got a sword and a revolver, yes, you can have your bam, 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 you can have your go with your revolver, and if it doesn't work, if you miss, or if the bullets go through the person and they carry on charging at you, as happened in many cases, you've still got a sword as a backup. You don't have time to reload the pistol if they're charging at you. You've still got a sword as a backup. You can still run them through the body or the face with the sword. You can still, if they're swinging a sword at your head, bam, you can still block. And in fact, that's a very important point. Von Tempsky's Rangers in New Zealand, for example, were famous for using a sword and a revolver, and they were basically taught to block, or rather a Bowie knife, sorry, sword, a Bowie knife and a revolver, and they were taught to block with the Bowie knife and shoot with the gun. So of course you just use the sword for defensive purposes, block whatever's coming in your way, and shoot the person, nail the person with the gun. Anyway, that digresses. So this, when the 1897 patent came in, it was still very much considered a weapon. Okay, it wasn't a dress accoutrement, although it was used on parade and it was worn as a sign of being an officer, but it still was a functional weapon, 100%. Okay, even in America with the 1902 or 3 patent that came in, that was considered a weapon. So really, around the year 1900, the swords that came out, whilst they are in many cases the last military sword designs that came out, they were still very much considered weapons at that point. Now, what I wanted to mention about this sword is, despite the fact that this dates to Edward VII's reign, so 1902 to 1910, so it's pre-First World War, most examples of these that you find are First World War, because in the First World War, vast numbers of soldiers were recruited, including officers, and lots of them unfortunately died in World War I. And because lots of officers died in World War I, in fact officers died at a higher rate than private soldiers because they were targeted by snipers, officers were dying at a high rate, but they were being replaced and recruited at a high rate, and therefore lots of officers had a need for swords, or at least they believed they had a need for swords, for parade purposes, if nothing else. And so the wartime production, the First World War wartime production of swords went absolutely skyrocketed, so much so that the traditional manufacturers of swords in World War I couldn't keep up with the demand. Wilkinson, Mole, Pillin, these companies, they just couldn't keep up with the demand for swords. And so other companies who traditionally had been knife makers, even cutlery makers, in Sheffield primarily, picked up the kind of excess, the surplus requirement for swords, and Sheffield makers, who really didn't have much of a history of making swords before, churned out swords. And it has to be said, many of them are crap. But they're sort of functional, you know, you could still obviously stab someone and hit someone with them. They are a bar of tempered steel. But this is a nice example. I actually don't know the maker on this one, but it's retailed rather by Pearson, Higgins and Co. Of Bristol, which is quite specific. Most swords that you find are from retailers, retailers and outfitters. That is, you'd go and buy your uniform there and your sword and maybe your revolver, even your ammunition. Most of them are in London, it has to be said, but it's quite nice when you find these regional ones. So this one's from the west of England, Bristol in this case, but it is intended to be a weapon, and that is very much accentuated by one feature, which is why I wanted to get this on camera quickly while I was actually kind of in photographing stock time. I kind of thought, I need to do a quick video about this. And this is service sharpened. So when you look at swords on my website or other people's websites, you'll often see when we're talking about antique swords, we describe them as being service sharpened, if they are service sharpened. What do we mean by that? Well, quite simply, military swords in the 19th and 20th centuries, for the most part, were made blunt. Now, don't think a thick blunt edge, think what we would almost these days term as semi-sharp or butter knife sharp. So essentially they were brought to an edge, but they weren't given the final grind or the final sort of hone, well really grind actually, to put the final bevel on. So in fact it's how a lot of blades, I believe, are made when they're put in for heat treatment, and then the sharpening happens obviously after the heat treatment. There's some advantages to keeping a bit more meat at the thin edge when you're heat treating, because you don't run so many risks to the fabric of the steel if you leave a bit more meat at the edge, and then remove that once it's been heat treated. But for many reasons these swords were manufactured slightly blunt, okay, not quite sharp. And then when, certainly in the British Army, when you were ordered on campaign, so for example at the beginning of World War I in 1914, the British Army and Navy as entities were told to sharpen swords. And that didn't just mean swords, it meant every type of sword, incidentally. It meant infantry officers' swords, cavalry swords, naval officers' swords, also meant cutlasses, and it also meant bayonets as well, okay, so all the bayonets got sharpened and everything. And that was a symbolic moment at which you sharpen your weapons, you're ready for war. I've spoken about this in the past, incidentally. Now, service sharpening is a topic in its own right which deserves probably a series of videos. What is service sharpening? Well, on a fundamental level, service sharpening means taking a blunt sword and making it sharp. But there isn't only one way of sharpening a sword. Number one, there are different angles, there are different edge bevels that you can put on an edge. And number two, there is a different amount of the edge that you might sharpen. So most military swords are single-edged with a short false edge. Now, when we find service sharpened swords, sometimes they have the entire of the front edge sharpened and they have the entire of the false edge sharpened. Okay, that's the most extreme example at one end of the spectrum. Sometimes, and very often I have to say, they're only sharpened from, if they are a cut and thrust sword, this is more of a thrust sword, but if they're a cut and thrust sword with a more, like an 1845 style blade or a cutlass blade, they're usually sharpened from about 10 inches or 8 or 10 inches from the base of the blade. They are sharpened from that point up to the tip and then a little bit of the false edge. The false edge incidentally isn't necessarily sharpened in most cases to facilitate false edge cuts, although those are a technique known as the manchette. Those are something you can use, but that's not necessarily why they were predominantly sharpened at the false edge. It's partly just to make your blade a lot sharper and more pointy and that is sharp, and more effective at thrusting, because if it's sharpened on both sides it will penetrate more easily, and we love easy penetration. And some blades are, rather than only being sharpened from down here up to here, only have a bit near the tip sharpened, or only this cutting portion. So normally when you cut with a sword, you cut with the centre of percussion, which is, as I describe in my classes, HEMA classes, I run historical fencing class in London, as I'm sure all of you know, the third quarter of the blade. So first quarter is for parrying, second quarter is not for anything specific, the third quarter is for cutting, and the last quarter is for thrusting. Generally speaking, that's simplistic, but that's basically true. This centre of percussion, the third quarter, sometimes with these military swords, they only sharpen from there upwards to the tip. But this sword, and this is why I wanted to put this on camera, is of another type, in that only the very spear tip, everything above my fingers here, so we're talking about 3 inches a point, is sharpened. Now, why would they do that? Well, in simple terms, this is regarded as a thrusting sword, and if you think about something like a bayonet, for example, you don't feel the need to necessarily use the edges of the bayonet unless you're using it off the rifle as a tool, but in combat, or a spear, you only need to stab the opponent. Now this is a thrust-centric sword. If you're going into combat and your intention is to run people through with this blade, in the same way that you might do with a spear or a bayonet or a lance, well, you only need the tip sharpened, don't you? And you have to bear in mind that this sword is Edward VII era, so it's 1902 to 1910, but that doesn't mean that the sword went out of service in 1910. that means the officer joined the army in Edward VII's reign. So an officer, let's think about this, an officer joining the army between 1902 and 1910, yeah, they're very likely to still be in the army in 1914. So this sword almost certainly was in service at the beginning of World War I, and at the beginning of World War I, no one knew how World War I was going to turn out. No one knew there were going to be tanks and aeroplanes on the front by the end of the war. Lots of people in Europe and America believed that World War I was going to be like the Franco-Prussian War, that there'd be huge cavalry actions, and there were some, admittedly, in World War I. But that swords would be running around with swords, officers would be running around with swords and a revolver. And they thought that this was going to be the armament of officers in World War I. And it has to be said, this is probably one of the reasons that the attrition of officers in World War I was so high, was because officers were still acting as officers and looking like officers on the front, and they were easy to target. As we go through World War I, we see that officers, generally speaking, downscaled some of their gear, obviously put more camo stuff on, in many cases carried rifles and bayonets. They didn't carry swords anymore for the most part, although there are some examples of swords being carried in World War I, but mostly they switched to carrying, they had a revolver, and they did lead from the front still. They did act as officers. Often they switched this for a walking stick or a something like a swagger stick, or even a riding crop or something like that. But for the most part, they tried to downplay their officerness, and they weren't running around with swords for the most part in World War I, certainly after the first year. But at the beginning of World War I, they didn't know that. They didn't know how things were going to pan out. So this has been service sharpened, almost certainly. I mean, it conceivably, given that this is Edward VII, it could be for the Boer War. If this was someone who joined the army in 1902, they could have gone straight out to South Africa, so this could have been sharpened for the Boer War. There were some other campaigns between the Boer War and World War I, some small colonial campaigns, could be for that. But I think balance of probability, given the number of officers that immediately went into service in 1914, I think there's a good chance that this was service sharpened for 1914. But the really interesting thing about it is that it has been very well service sharpened, and it is a very fine edge, very, very well done here and here. Now obviously this sword's over 100 years old, so it's not, the edge isn't perfect. I couldn't shave with that, and I'm probably not going to cut myself with that, but it is would be very easy to bring that up to sort of shaving sharp with a tiny bit of polishing, and it's very, very pointy. But I do think it's interesting that, as I talk about, there are different types of service sharpening, and this is at the one end of the spectrum. Some of them are service sharpened right from the base of the blade, where the blade type permits. You couldn't do that with this type of blade because they're an I-beam section up until there. You can only service sharpen them from about there on this type of sword. But on the earlier Victorian types of swords, some are service sharpened from the base of the blade, some are sharpened from about 8 or 10 inches up, so you're left with a blunt parrying portion, and because there's no real reason to have the sword edged here. Some are sharpened only from the centre of percussion upwards, and some, and I have had Victorian examples of this as well, are only service sharpened for the tip. So there we go. If you have a thrusting sword, does it need to be sharp down here? Well, in most cases, no. Personally, if this was my sword, if I was being called up for World War I would have it edged for the whole part of the edge that it's possible to edge it for, which is down to about there. Why would I do that? Because why not? I like being able to cut, and these can still cut fairly, can be useful to cut with these. And if I was using the 1897 pattern, coming against people, bayoneteers or other swordsmen or whatever, indeed the ability to give a cut, it might not be a cleaving cut, but the ability to give some type of cut which has an effect on someone's face, neck, knee, this kind of thing, the targets that I like to cut at, or indeed hand, if you can get to the hand, as well as obviously thrusting most of the time. I like being able to do both. But clearly this person thought, nah, this is a thruster, I'm just going to be stabbing people. And so they only had it sharpened at the tip. I guess less to maintain, quicker to do, maybe it was done in a hurry, who knows. And incidentally it has clearly been done with a form of grinding wheel, which was the typical way of sharpening these back in the day. Anyway, thanks for watching. This incidentally is going up for sale, I think today. So give us a like and a subscribe. If you're interested in antique swords, go and have a look at my other business, Eastern Antique Arms. And we've got Facebook pages as well for Eastern Antique Arms, and obviously Schola Gladiatoria. I will see you soon for another video on Schola Gladiatoria channel, and thanks for watching. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!